Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The oldest cosmic horror monsters in literature did not begin as entertainment. They emerged slowly from ancient epics, medieval cosmologies, and early scientific speculation, appearing first as fragments rather than fully formed creatures. Long before modern horror named them, writers described beings older than humanity, older than civilization, and sometimes older than the world itself. These entities were rarely portrayed as enemies in any conventional sense. They existed as evidence, signs that reality extended far beyond human comprehension and control. This documentary examines those earliest monsters across literary history, beginning with ancient texts and continuing through the strange intellectual developments of the 18th and 19th centuries. We will trace how primordial chaos beings, abyssal intelligences, and starborn presences evolved into the fully articulated cosmic horrors of modern fiction. The investigation follows language, symbolism, and narrative technique as much as it follows the monsters themselves. Consider this carefully. Many of these creatures were presented as discoveries rather than inventions. Authors framed them through manuscripts, ruins, translations, and testimonies that suggested continuity across centuries. The result is a tradition that reads less like fiction and more like a scattered archive. We must pause here to recognize an unsettling possibility. Once these ideas are understood, they become difficult to dismiss entirely. By listening, you participate in the same chain of inquiry that earlier readers supposedly found impossible to abandon. We begin with the origins. Many readers assume cosmic horror begins in the early 20th century, usually with the emergence of systematic mythologies in American weird fiction around the 1920s and 1930s. This assumption reflects the visibility of later authors rather than the origin of the ideas themselves. Long before modern cosmic horror acquired formal terminology, literary traditions already described entities that existed beyond human understanding. Ancient epics from the second millennium BCE portray primordial beings as forces predating creation, while medieval chronicles occasionally referenced creatures inhabiting remote or inaccessible regions of the world. These early depictions framed monsters as structural features of reality rather than narrative antagonists. The creature served as a boundary marker between known and unknown existence. Consider this carefully. Cosmic horror develops gradually when monsters cease to represent moral deviation and begin to represent ontological uncertainty. The shift unfolds across centuries of literary experimentation. The earliest cosmic monsters were therefore not inventions of modern imagination, but rediscoveries shaped by changing intellectual conditions. Earlier traditions treated monsters primarily as symbols of moral disorder within a structured universe governed by divine intention. Medieval bestiaries, composed between the 12th and 14th centuries, explained strange creatures through theological interpretation and moral allegory. The monster illustrated sin, temptation, or divine punishment within an intelligible cosmic hierarchy. Yet some texts preserved a different logic, describing beings that resisted moral classification entirely. Certain passages in classical sources portray primordial entities whose existence predates divine authority itself, suggesting a universe not fully ordered by human ethics or divine governance. These creatures were not wicked in the familiar sense. They were indifferent. This distinction marks an essential transformation. The monster evolves from moral warning into existential evidence. Not a corrupter of human souls, but a reminder of humanity's uncertain position within a vast and poorly understood structure. The intellectual consequences of this transition become clearer in later centuries, when scientific knowledge destabilized inherited cosmologies and made such indifference increasingly plausible. The industrial age intensified this transformation by expanding the scale at which reality was understood. Geological discoveries during the late 18th and early 19th centuries revealed a planet far older than previously imagined, replacing biblical chronologies with deep time measured in millions of years. Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833, described gradual planetary change across immense durations that dwarfed recorded history. Extinction emerged as a scientific reality rather than a mythological catastrophe. Astronomy expanded human perspective even further. Telescopic observation throughout the 19th century revealed stellar distances that rendered Earth insignificant within a nearly incomprehensible spatial framework. Humanity appeared as a brief and localized phenomenon in a universe governed by impersonal physical laws. We must pause here because this intellectual environment produced a new kind of fear. The anxiety did not arise from divine judgment or supernatural punishment. It emerged from the possibility that the universe possessed no special concern for human existence whatsoever. Cosmic monsters begin to flourish precisely when such a universe becomes imaginable. Early Gothic writers translated these new anxieties into narrative form, often without explicitly describing cosmic entities themselves. Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis explored psychological dread rooted in uncertain perception, while later authors expanded the scale of the unknown beyond earthly environments. Edgar Allan Poe introduced beings and forces whose origins lay outside conventional experience, particularly in tales written during the 1830s and 1840s that explored mesmerism, premature burial, and altered states of consciousness. Poe's narratives often suggested hidden realities existing alongside ordinary perception, accessible only through abnormal conditions. These stories move toward a non-human-centered perspective by implying that reality contains structures indifferent to human meaning. Similar developments appear in the late 19th century, when writers increasingly portrayed the natural world as autonomous rather than responsive to human action. The monster begins to exist, whether or not humans encounter it. Not an adversary seeking victims, but a presence continuing its existence regardless of observation. The narrative focus shifts from survival to comprehension. This transformation also altered the mindset of authors themselves. Writers who contributed to early cosmic horror approached their material with investigative seriousness, presenting fictional discoveries through scholarly frameworks that imitated scientific method and historical research. Fear of death becomes secondary to fear of knowledge, since discovery threatens the stability of intellectual assumptions upon which ordinary life depends. Intellectual horror emerges as a distinct literary form during the 19th century, emphasizing realization rather than confrontation. The monster functions as a philosophical proposition, demonstrating that reality exceeds the explanatory systems humans construct. Authors increasingly adopted the role of investigators who uncovered disturbing evidence through archives, translations, and testimonies. The narrative voice resembles a researcher assembling fragments of incomplete data. This reveals something profound about the development of cosmic horror. The reader participates in an inquiry rather than a spectacle. The monster is encountered through interpretation rather than combat. By the late 19th century, a new narrative pattern had become visible across multiple authors and traditions. The monster appears primarily as revelation, evidence of a deeper structure underlying ordinary experience. Stories emphasize discovery, documentation, and interpretation instead of physical struggle. The decisive moment occurs when characters understand what they have uncovered, not when they attempt to destroy it. Horror emerges from recognition that the universe operates according to principles indifferent to human survival or comprehension. This pattern anticipates later systematic mythologies, while remaining rooted in earlier intellectual developments. The monster becomes significant because it proves something unsettling about reality itself. The next step in this evolution requires examining the cultural and philosophical traditions that supplied the conceptual foundations for these early cosmic beings. Cosmic horror monsters did not arise in isolation from literary invention. They developed from much older conceptual traditions that described reality as fundamentally unstable and only partially accessible to human understanding. The earliest precursors appear in Mesopotamian cosmology, where primordial beings existed before both humanity and the gods themselves. Texts preserved on cuneiform tablets dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE describe chaotic waters, monstrous presences, and formative forces that precede ordered creation. These beings are neither villains nor adversaries in any conventional sense. They represent conditions of existence rather than moral agents. Consider the primordial ocean goddess Tiamat, who appears in the Enuma Elish as a generative force older than divine authority. Her defeat establishes cosmic order, yet the narrative implies that chaos remains the original state from which structured reality temporarily emerges. This pattern introduces a crucial idea later central to cosmic horror. The universe rests upon unstable foundations older than intelligible history. Ancient myth already imagines entities whose existence renders human chronology insignificant. Mesopotamian chaos beings also demonstrate a striking form of cosmic indifference. These entities rarely interact with humanity directly and often exist beyond the scale of human concerns. Some myths describe creatures inhabiting the depths of the cosmic ocean or remote regions of existence that humans cannot reach. Their actions reshape reality without reference to human welfare or moral order. Not evil, but indifferent, these figures embody forces that operate independently of human meaning. Triadic descriptions appear repeatedly in surviving texts. The primordial deep, the silent void, the unmeasured waters. Such language conveys enormity without precise definition, suggesting a universe only partially stabilized by divine intervention. This reveals something profound about early mythology. The oldest monsters function as explanations for cosmic structure rather than threats to individual lives. Their existence implies that creation itself required overcoming forces that remain latent beneath the visible world. Later cosmic horror narratives inherit this idea almost unchanged, replacing mythological language with scientific or pseudo-historical framing. Greek cosmology developed similar concepts with greater philosophical precision, especially in traditions recorded between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE. Hesiod's Theogony describes primordial entities such as Chaos, Nyx, and Tartarus as conditions of existence rather than personalities. These beings precede the Olympian gods and represent structural aspects of reality: darkness, depth, and generative void. The Titans themselves are often interpreted as moral antagonists in later retellings, yet early accounts portray them more accurately as geological or cosmological forces. Kronos governs cycles of time, Oceanus encircles the world, and Hyperion embodies celestial radiance. Their conflict with Zeus symbolizes the stabilization of a volatile universe rather than a simple struggle between good and evil. Creatures such as Typhon further reinforce the idea of cosmic instability by representing forces capable of overturning divine order entirely. The Greek cosmos appears structured yet precarious, a temporary arrangement maintained against deeper instability. Compared with Mesopotamian myth, Greek traditions introduce greater narrative coherence, but the underlying vision remains similar. Humanity occupies a narrow interval within a much larger and less predictable structure. Medieval cosmology preserved these ideas within a different intellectual framework, emphasizing invisible hierarchies of beings arranged between humanity and divine authority. Scholastic writers of the 12th and 13th centuries described elaborate chains of existence extending from material life to purely spiritual intelligences. Angels and demons were understood as rational entities whose nature differed fundamentally from human experience. These beings inhabited domains inaccessible to ordinary perception, operating according to laws only partially understood by theologians. The medieval universe therefore contained vast regions beyond direct observation, populated by intelligences whose purposes remained obscure. Fear emerged from uncertainty about these hidden structures rather than from physical danger alone. The cosmos appeared ordered, yet its order remained only partially visible. Humanity occupied a defined but limited position within a hierarchy extending far beyond earthly knowledge. We must pause here because medieval cosmology introduces a distinctive form of cosmic anxiety, the fear that reality contains intelligences whose scale and perspective render human concerns insignificant. The individual life becomes a minor episode within a structure too large to comprehend fully. Early modern philosophy transformed these inherited ideas by replacing theological explanations with mechanistic models of the universe. Scientific developments during the 17th century, particularly those associated with Galileo and Newton, described a cosmos governed by mathematical laws rather than spiritual agencies. The heliocentric model displaced Earth from the center of creation, while universal gravitation suggested a system operating independently of divine intervention. By the late 17th century, the universe increasingly appeared as a self-regulating mechanism rather than a moral order. Human consciousness occupied no privileged position within this structure. Thinkers such as Baruch Spinoza proposed that nature operates according to impersonal necessity, eliminating the distinction between divine intention and physical law. The resulting worldview presented a cosmos governed by forces indifferent to individual existence. Comparisons with medieval cosmology reveal a striking shift. Invisible intelligences were replaced by invisible laws, yet both implied limits to human understanding. The unknown persisted, even as its explanation changed form. From these developments emerged the earliest forms of philosophical pessimism, which articulated a universe lacking inherent moral structure. 18th and 19th century thinkers increasingly emphasized the contingency of human existence within a vast and indifferent reality. Arthur Schopenhauer, writing in the early 19th century, described existence as driven by impersonal forces beyond rational control. Later philosophers expanded this perspective by portraying human consciousness as a temporary phenomenon within an evolving universe. The idea of indifferent reality became intellectually respectable rather than merely speculative. The seeds of cosmic horror thought appear precisely at this intersection of mythology and philosophy. Ancient traditions provided images of primordial forces, while modern philosophy supplied conceptual frameworks capable of interpreting them without theological reassurance. Rhetorical questions naturally arise from this convergence. If the universe existed long before humanity, what guarantees that human existence remains relevant now? The next subsection examines how language itself evolved to express such unsettling possibilities. The language used to describe cosmic horror monsters developed slowly from earlier traditions that associated antiquity with authority and strangeness with authenticity. Writers seeking to evoke entities older than recorded history relied on vocabulary suggesting immense temporal depth, often drawn from geology, archaeology, and classical philology. Terms such as primordial, antediluvian, and cyclopean appeared with increasing frequency in 19th century literature, each implying a world that existed long before human civilization. Geological terminology proved especially influential after the 1830s, when deep time entered popular discourse through scientific publications and public lectures. These words signaled duration beyond imagination rather than precise chronology. The effect depended on suggestion rather than measurement. Authors used linguistic cues to evoke layers of forgotten existence, buried strata, fossilized remnants, eroded monuments. This reveals something profound about cosmic horror's development. The monster becomes ancient through language before it becomes ancient through narrative. Words themselves establish the sense of immeasurable duration that later stories merely confirm. Terminology, implying pre-human existence, also created a subtle shift in narrative perspective by positioning humanity as a late arrival within a much older world. Phrases such as "before the dawn of man" or "older than memory" appear frequently in 19th century speculative writing, conveying antiquity without requiring precise historical reference. Such expressions functioned as linguistic thresholds marking the limits of human knowledge. Authors often grouped related terms into triadic sequences: age, depth, and silence, to evoke temporal distance without explanation. The language itself implied that human chronology represented only a fragment of a larger continuum. Not historical antiquity, but ontological antiquity becomes the essential theme of cosmic horror vocabulary. Writers established this distinction through careful word choice that suggested existence independent of human record or recognition. Linguistic signals of vast duration thus prepared readers to accept monsters whose origins lay outside familiar historical frameworks. We must pause here because the vocabulary of cosmic age creates expectations that shape interpretation before any creature appears within the narrative. Names that resist pronunciation form a second essential element in the symbolic language of cosmic horror. Authors discovered early that unfamiliar phonetic patterns produced a sense of intellectual distance that ordinary vocabulary could not achieve. Non-European sound combinations appeared increasingly in speculative fiction during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reflecting growing awareness of global linguistic diversity. Sequences of consonants or unusual vowel patterns disrupted the reader's expectation of pronounceable structure. The psychological effect arises from hesitation rather than comprehension. A name that cannot be easily spoken seems to originate outside familiar linguistic systems. This technique appears across multiple authors and traditions, suggesting a shared understanding of language as a marker of belonging. Consider this carefully. Pronunciation difficulty signals conceptual difficulty. When a word resists articulation, it implies that the object it names may resist understanding as well. Linguistic alienation thus becomes an indirect method for representing the unknowable. Language also functions as a barrier separating human perception from cosmic reality. Characters encountering ancient manuscripts or unfamiliar inscriptions often struggle with translation, discovering meanings only partially accessible through ordinary linguistic frameworks. Fragmentary texts, uncertain etymologies, and ambiguous symbols reinforce the sense that language itself imposes limits on knowledge. Authors frequently described words as approximations rather than accurate designations, acknowledging the inadequacy of human vocabulary when confronted with unfamiliar phenomena. The problem extends beyond translation into conceptual structure. Human languages evolved to describe human experience, leaving them poorly equipped to express radically different forms of existence. Comparisons with theological language reveal a similar pattern, since medieval mystics likewise described divine realities as exceeding ordinary speech. Cosmic horror inherits this linguistic humility while redirecting it toward impersonal realities. The unknown persists partly because language cannot fully contain it. Symbolic physical forms provided another method for expressing cosmic strangeness, without requiring precise biological explanation. Writers increasingly described creatures whose anatomy violated ordinary expectations, combining features from incompatible organisms into unstable hybrid structures. Non-symmetrical arrangements appeared frequently, since bilateral symmetry represents one of the most familiar patterns in terrestrial life. Creatures lacking this structure seemed fundamentally alien, even when described in minimal detail. Fluid geometry further reinforced this effect by suggesting bodies capable of shifting shape or resisting stable definition. Authors often emphasized texture and movement rather than anatomical precision, allowing readers to imagine forms that remained only partially visible. These descriptions functioned as conceptual experiments rather than zoological accounts. The monster demonstrates that biological assumptions derived from earthly life may not apply universally. This reveals something profound about cosmic horror symbolism. Physical form becomes evidence of alternative natural laws rather than a mere source of fear. Spatial vocabulary expanded these ideas by describing environments that violated ordinary geometric expectations. Non-Euclidean geometry entered popular awareness during the 19th century through mathematical developments that challenged traditional assumptions about space. Writers adapted these concepts into descriptions of architecture and landscape, portraying structures composed of impossible angles and distorted proportions. Infinite curves, collapsing perspectives, and shifting alignments suggested spaces incompatible with normal perception. Readers encountered buildings that seemed older than human engineering, or locations that resisted stable mapping. Compared with earlier Gothic architecture, which emphasized scale and complexity, cosmic horror environments emphasized conceptual impossibility. The spatial anomaly implied deeper ontological disturbance. When geometry fails, ordinary assumptions about reality begin to collapse as well. The environment becomes evidence of a universe structured according to unfamiliar principles. Time language completed this symbolic system by describing existence in cyclical or geological terms rather than linear historical progression. References to eternal recurrence appeared in both mythological and philosophical contexts, suggesting that cosmic events unfold across intervals far exceeding human observation. Sleep and awakening metaphors expressed temporal suspension, portraying ancient beings as dormant rather than extinct. Geological metaphors reinforced this sense of continuity, by comparing living entities to buried strata awaiting rediscovery. The language of stone, sediment, and erosion implied processes unfolding over immense durations without human participation. Authors grouped temporal images into recurring triads, cycles, alignments, awakenings. These expressions conveyed continuity without explanation. Time itself appeared as a vast medium within which human history occupied only a brief interval. The next subsection examines how writers constructed narrative authenticity around these linguistic and symbolic foundations. Writers of early cosmic horror understood that the monster becomes more unsettling when presented not as invention, but as rediscovery. To achieve this effect, they relied on pseudo-scholarship, an intricate narrative device that imitates academic method while secretly fabricating every detail. Fake citations appeared with increasing regularity in 19th century literature, often referencing non-existent journals, forgotten monographs, or obscure antiquarian societies. Invented manuscripts served a similar purpose. Authors framed their stories as translations of lost texts, supposedly recovered from private collections, monastic archives, or archaeological expeditions. This created an atmosphere of scholarly detachment, suggesting that the writer functioned not as creator, but as editor. Archaeological framing deepened this illusion by situating discoveries within excavations, ruined temples, or long-buried vaults, reinforcing the idea that the monster predates both history and narrative. Consider this carefully. Pseudo-scholarship does not add realism, but authenticity, making the reader feel implicated in an ongoing investigation rather than a self-contained fiction. Fragmented evidence strengthened this authenticity by mirroring the incomplete nature of historical research. Many influential narratives present partial documents that omit crucial details, creating interpretive gaps that the reader must navigate. Missing pages, damaged inscriptions, and incomplete chronicles suggest that the available evidence represents only a fragment of a larger truth. These textual absences operate as narrative devices, implying that what cannot be read may be more dangerous than what can. Unreliable narrators emerged naturally from this structure. Characters, responsible for assembling documents, often express uncertainty, contradict themselves, or acknowledge gaps in their understanding. Broken timelines, where events are recorded out of sequence or connected only through inferred relationships, reinforce the sense that reality resists coherent mapping. The reader encounters the monster not directly, but through inconsistencies, omissions, and interpretive failures. The effect resembles archival research, where truth emerges only through partial reconstruction. The illusion of historical depth depends on layering stories within stories, creating the impression of a long tradition rather than a single narrative event. Writers achieve this by referencing earlier, fictional accounts within their texts, implying continuity across generations of witnesses. A manuscript discovered in one story might mention an even older source, itself based on oral testimony or fragments of forgotten mythology. This recursive structure establishes false antiquity by embedding invented materials within multiple chronological strata. Artificial mythic timelines then emerge, organizing fictional events across centuries or millennia in ways that mimic real historical development. Such techniques allow the monster to appear simultaneously ancient and recurring. Not a singular intrusion into human affairs, but a long-standing presence rediscovered at irregular intervals. Comparisons to actual mythological traditions reveal how effectively this strategy simulates organic cultural growth. it produces a mythos that feels accumulated rather than authored. Monsters described as historical constants further enhance this illusion. Entities appear across widely separated centuries, reported by individuals who share no cultural or geographic connection. Independent witness accounts, sometimes presented as journal entries, sometimes as marginal notes, reinforce the idea of continuity beyond memory. These accounts rarely agree in detail, which, paradoxically, strengthens their credibility by reflecting the natural variation found in real historical testimony. Triadic listing becomes particularly effective here. 3 sightings, 3 documents, 3 contradictory interpretations. The repetition creates structure while preserving ambiguity. We must pause here because this technique introduces a crucial narrative implication. If the monster appears across centuries, it cannot belong to any single historical framework. It exists outside human time entirely, entering and exiting the record according to patterns that remain obscure. Narrative distance completes this myth-building system by positioning the reader several steps away from the events being described. Second-hand accounts dominate early cosmic horror, with characters learning about phenomena through letters, interviews, or archival materials rather than direct experience. Translated journals reinforce this detachment by presenting the monster through linguistic mediation, implying that the original author recorded something they themselves barely understood. Anonymous witnesses appear frequently, contributing testimony without personal detail, as though they serve merely as conduits for disturbing information. Indirect observation becomes the final structural layer, ensuring that the monster remains glimpsed, inferred, or reconstructed rather than explicitly described. This distance preserves mystery while maintaining the intellectual tone central to cosmic horror's early development. The reader, like the narrator, becomes a researcher attempting to assemble meaning from scattered fragments. These narrative strategies formed the foundation upon which modern cosmic horror mythologies would later build systematic structures. Before examining those developments, we turn next to the philosophical and thematic concerns that shaped the nature of the monsters themselves. Cosmic horror rests upon a cluster of philosophical ideas that emerged, gradually through scientific discovery, shifting metaphysics and growing cultural awareness of humanity's precarious position within the universe. At the center of these ideas lies a simple yet destabilizing recognition. Humanity occupies only a brief moment within an immense and uncaring cosmos. Writers who shaped early cosmic horror treated this realization not as a scientific fact alone, but as an existential rupture. Humanity appears as a recent phenomenon, its civilizations rising and falling within intervals negligible on geological scales. Consider this carefully. Once readers begin to view themselves through such temporal and spatial perspective, the familiar anchors of meaning start to dissolve. Civilizations become temporary arrangements, species-level fragility becomes unavoidable, and human history shrinks into a narrow bracket between deeper ages. The geological perspective, popularized in the 19th century, amplified this shift by revealing continents forming and eroding over millions of years. Within such a framework, human monuments become minor distortions in a landscape shaped by forces indifferent to human presence. Entropy and decay provide the second major strand of cosmic horror philosophy. Scientific developments in the mid-19th century introduced thermodynamic concepts that reshaped cultural understandings of time. The idea that the universe tends toward disorder through universal decline, diminishing energy, and increasing randomness found its way quickly into literature. Civilizations collapsing became more than a historical observation. It became an ontological certainty embedded within the structure of existence. Writers mirrored this scientific pessimism by describing abandoned cities, eroded temples, and crumbling architectures that symbolize the unavoidable dissolution of all things. Stars themselves became symbols of cosmic mortality, since astronomical research revealed stellar life cycles culminating in eventual destruction. Cosmic horror, therefore, does not merely borrow scientific imagery. It translates scientific inevitability into existential narrative. Structures dissolve, meanings erode, and the universe moves steadily toward conditions hostile to life. Comparisons with earlier apocalyptic traditions reveal a crucial distinction. The decline imagined in cosmic horror lacks divine intention or narrative purpose. It is not punishment, but process. Dream and reality instability further expanded these philosophical concerns by introducing doubt about the reliability of perception. Writers increasingly treated dreams as alternate worlds rather than simple psychological phenomena. Dream landscapes possess their own logic, geography, and chronology, sometimes continuing across multiple nights or recurring after long intervals. Sleep became a gateway through which characters encountered spaces inaccessible to waking consciousness. These narratives blurred the boundaries between mental experience and external reality, suggesting that the mind served as a fragile filter rather than an accurate recording device. If consciousness mediates reality rather than perceiving it directly, the nature of the cosmos becomes even more uncertain. Readers confronted the possibility that the world seen in waking life might represent only one arrangement among many potential versions. This instability echoes earlier philosophical skepticism, while introducing a more unsettling implication. The cosmos may contain levels of structure inaccessible to ordinary perception, available only through altered states. The dream, therefore, functions not as escape, but as revelation. The concept of time without direction intensifies this instability by undermining linear chronology. Eternal cycles appear in mythological precedents, yet in cosmic horror, they lose theological grounding and become signs of structural indifference. Forgotten past returning does not signal moral consequence, but temporal recurrence devoid of intention. Recurrence themes suggest that history does not progress toward resolution or improvement. Instead, events repeat or re-emerge without predictable pattern. Stories often portray discoveries that reveal traces of earlier cycles of civilization, implying that humanity occupies merely one iteration within a larger temporal structure. Collapse of chronology becomes a narrative technique as well, with events unfolding out of sequence or appearing simultaneously across different eras. These disruptions create a sense that time itself may be another unstable dimension rather than a reliable measure of existence. We must pause here because temporal instability forces a fundamental question. If time is not directional, what becomes of meaning built upon historical continuity? All of these concepts converge in the final philosophical foundation of cosmic horror, the indifferent cosmos. The universe, in this framework, contains monsters without malice, events without purpose, and conditions without narrative logic. This is not pessimism for its own sake. It is a recognition that human values do not extend beyond the boundaries of human culture. In many stories, the most unsettling creatures display no hostility at all. They simply exist, continuing activities unrelated to humanity. Their indifference, rather than aggression, constitutes the real source of horror. Events occur without intention, producing consequences only incidentally. The universe lacks narrative structure, meaning that human attempts to impose coherence inevitably fail. Meaninglessness becomes horror precisely because it removes the possibility of negotiation. When the cosmos contains no embedded narrative, there is nothing to appeal to and nothing to resist. Philosophical frameworks such as existentialism later articulated these implications, but cosmic horror explored them earlier through narrative experiment. Together, these concepts form a coherent, intellectual foundation that transforms monsters from enemies into revelations. They show what the universe is rather than what it threatens to do. In the next subsection, we examine how these ideas shaped the depiction of cosmic entities themselves. Cosmic horror does not rely on a single taxonomy of monsters. Instead, it presents categories of existence that challenge biological, metaphysical, and cognitive assumptions developed through human experience. These entities and forces emerged gradually across literary history, each representing a different facet of the unsettling universe described in early cosmic narratives. Their diversity reflects a central truth. Horror arises not from confrontation, but from the realization that life occupies only one small region of a much larger, indifferent continuum. Primordial sea monsters form one of the earliest and most persistent categories. Ancient mythologies often imagined the ocean as an original domain, predating land, sky, and recognizable life. Literature inherited this symbolic structure and repurposed it to express evolutionary and geological concepts introduced during the 19th century. When writers described creatures older than terrestrial animals, they often framed them as abyssal intelligences inhabiting depths untouched by sunlight. These beings embodied temporal as well as spatial distance. The deep ocean functioned as a repository of forgotten epochs, preserving forms unchanged across millions of years. Water therefore became a cosmic symbol rather than a natural element, fluid, borderless, and associated with creation and dissolution alike. Consider how frequently authors evoke scale, darkness, and pressure when describing abyssal entities. The sea becomes both physical environment and conceptual metaphor, suggesting regions of existence inaccessible to human perception. Comparisons with Mesopotamian and Greek tradition reveal continuity. The earliest cosmic monsters arose from water, and later literature retained this association, even after adopting scientific frameworks. Star-born entities represent a distinct but related lineage. These beings arrive from beyond Earth, often possessing antiquity measured not in centuries, but in stellar life cycles. Their origins lie in a universe that predates humanity by unimaginable spans, and their arrival implies continuity across interstellar distances. Writers of the late 19th century increasingly adopted extraterrestrial frameworks, reflecting new astronomical discoveries and popular interest in planetary science. The result was a shift from mythological gigantism to conceptual alienation. Non-biological life appeared frequently, with entities described as energetic formations, crystalline structures, or gaseous intelligences. Their physical forms resisted comparison to terrestrial organisms, emphasizing their independence from earthly conditions. Stellar origin myths reinforce this alienness by connecting monsters to the life and death of stars. Instead of existing within Earth's evolutionary history, star-born creatures belong to cosmological processes extending far beyond familiar scales. We must pause here because such entities symbolize humanity's displacement within modern scientific cosmology. They demonstrate that life need not resemble biological patterns known on Earth. Dreamland beings extend this displacement into psychological territory. Writers experimented with the idea that reality includes layers accessible only through altered consciousness. Entities existing outside physical reality occupy landscapes shaped by dream geography, regions with shifting boundaries, inconsistent chronology, and symbolic rather than material coherence. These dream worlds often resemble collective unconscious imagery, combining personal memory with archetypal forms. The beings inhabiting them therefore reflect psychological structures as much as metaphysical ones. Some authors described these entities as manifestations of forgotten evolutionary stages, while others treated them as autonomous intelligences intersecting with human consciousness only during sleep. Dreams became experimental laboratories for imagining creatures unbound by physical laws. Such beings challenge assumptions about perception by blurring distinctions between internal and external phenomena. A dream creature may influence waking life, suggesting porous boundaries between mind and world. The philosophical implication is clear. If consciousness accesses only a fraction of available reality, entities existing outside that fraction need not obey familiar logic. Sleeping giants introduce another pattern by embodying geological rather than psychological or cosmic temporality. These entities are often buried beneath mountains, trapped within polar ice, or entombed in sedimentary layers older than human civilization. Their dormancy suggests imprisonment rather than death. Geological imprisonment allows writers to integrate deep time into narrative structure, since awakening becomes a cyclical event rather than a singular catastrophe. Dormant intelligences re-emerge according to patterns unknown to humanity, revealing a universe governed by cycles of activity and rest. This pattern mirrors geological processes such as tectonic movement, glaciation, and erosion. By associating monsters with such forces, literature positions them within natural rather than supernatural frameworks. Dormancy also amplifies tension by implying prior epochs during which these beings influence the world. When they awaken, they do so without reference to human calendars or concerns. The cycle continues regardless of human presence. Triadic listing appears frequently when describing such giants: burial, sleep, awakening. Each term reinforces the idea of a process rather than an event. Invisible presences represent perhaps the most conceptually challenging category. These entities lack form, making them perceptible only through indirect effects. Writers use them to explore perceptual and epistemological limits, emphasizing how reality might contain agents that elude direct observation. Effects without bodies, footsteps without figures, temperature changes without sources, distortions without identifiable cause, signal the presence of something operating beyond sensory thresholds. Indirect manifestations generate cognitive tension because they leave interpretation uncertain. A reader encounters the monster through inference rather than description, mirroring the experience of characters who cannot trust their senses. Perceptual distortions become narrative clues, suggesting that ordinary perception fails to reveal the full structure of reality. Comparisons to medieval angelology or early modern metaphysics show recurring themes: invisible intelligences shaping visible phenomena. Yet cosmic horror removes theological stability, leaving only uncertainty. Invisible presences, thus, function as philosophical provocations, revealing the incompleteness of human cognition. Collectively, these categories demonstrate the breadth of imagination applied to cosmic entities. Each type challenges a different assumption: biological, spatial, temporal, psychological, or perceptual. The next subsection examines how human interaction with such beings produces psychological collapse, transforming discovery into existential crisis. Cosmic horror depends on a specific pattern of human response. The encounter with the unknown damages the observer rather than the monster. Madness is not an add-on to the genre. It is the inevitable psychological consequence of attempting to integrate information that exceeds the mind's structural limits. Writers consistently portray witnessing as trauma, where knowledge itself inflicts harm. When characters glimpse a creature older than civilization or confront evidence of a universe without moral structure, the damage occurs not through physical threat, but through cognitive incompatibility. Observation becomes irreversible because the mind cannot return to the assumptions that previously sustained coherent reality. This marks a crucial divergence from earlier Gothic traditions, in which fear arises from external danger. In cosmic horror, collapse originates within the observer's interpretive framework. The breakdown of reality becomes internal long before any external destruction takes place. The process leading to collapse rarely happens all at once. Gradual realization functions as a structural principle across many narratives. Characters encounter small anomalies, a misplaced artifact, a fragment of unusual text, a pattern that contradicts established scientific knowledge. Each anomaly alone seems trivial, yet together they accumulate into escalating awareness. The mind begins to recognize connections that undermine familiar categories. Pattern recognition becomes the mechanism of destruction rather than comfort. Anomalies multiply. Cognitive overload becomes inevitable because the character must either expand their conceptual framework beyond human scale or retreat into denial. Triadic structures appear frequently in this progression. The first anomaly ignored, the second examined, the third impossible to dismiss. We must pause here because the pattern reveals something profound. Madness emerges not from fear, but from an inability to reconcile incompatible realities. The observer's world does not shatter, it unravels. Madness in cosmic horror thus becomes a form of insight rather than deficiency. Insanity functions as partial understanding, an incomplete but significant awareness of truths inaccessible to ordinary perception. Writers describe characters who speak in fragments, draw symbols compulsively, or express visions that others interpret as deranged. Yet these expressions often contain genuine, if distorted, information about the forces at work. Vision beyond normal perception is presented as both gift and curse, isolating the character from society while granting them access to deeper layers of reality. Language breakdown becomes a recurring motif, since linguistic structures evolved to describe human-scale events rather than cosmic ones. When characters confront realities without precedent, their vocabulary collapses into metaphor, repetition, or silence. Comparisons with mystical experience reveal a parallel, though cosmic horror removes the possibility of transcendence. What remains is awareness that cannot be assimilated. Given these conditions, it is unsurprising that scholars frequently appear as protagonists. Antiquarians, linguists, scientists, and archivists populate early cosmic narratives because their professions involve uncovering fragments of forgotten knowledge. These characters approach the unknown not with superstition, but with method, making their eventual collapse more disturbing. Antiquarians uncover inscriptions older than recorded history. Linguists translate texts that resist interpretation. Scientists confront anomalies that undermine empirical laws. and archivists assemble documents revealing patterns too vast for human comprehension. Their intellectual habits, precise observation, rigorous analysis, and relentless curiosity become liabilities when encountering cosmic entities. The narrative effect is significant. Expertise becomes a pathway to ruin. The very skills that make these individuals trustworthy also make them vulnerable to truths that ordinary minds never confront. Social disbelief amplifies this downward trajectory. Institutions often reject the truth presented by witnesses because accepting it would undermine foundational assumptions about the world. Universities dismiss anomalous findings as misinterpretation. Scientific societies refuse to publish unsettling data. Religious authorities suppress evidence contradicting doctrinal cosmology. The witness becomes isolated not only by their own experience, but by society's refusal to acknowledge it. Suppression of evidence becomes a structural feature, reflecting the collective investment in maintaining normalcy. Normalcy defense emerges when communities reinterpret extraordinary events through familiar categories, refusing explanations that imply structural instability in the universe. Rhetorical questions appear naturally at this stage. What happens when society requires stability, but the evidence suggests chaos? Characters confronting this dilemma experience isolation more profound than physical exile. They occupy a conceptual space inaccessible to others, making communication impossible. This interplay between knowledge, perception, and social rejection forms the psychological core of cosmic horror. Human interaction with cosmic entities does not produce heroism or resolution. It produces fragmentation, insight, and erasure. The next subsection examines how these dynamics crystallize into the concept of forbidden knowledge, where understanding becomes indistinguishable from epistemic collapse. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror is not merely information withheld from the public. It is a structural feature of the universe that punishes understanding. Writers construct this idea through layered discoveries that draw characters ever deeper into intellectual descent. A fragment leads to a manuscript leads to an inscription, and the inscription contradicts the character's foundational beliefs. Each stage expands the scope of the inquiry while narrowing the possibility of escape. Progressive revelation therefore functions as trap rather than enlightenment. There is no safe stopping point because the logic of research demands continuation. Consider this carefully. Once the first anomaly appears, the investigator becomes complicit. The mind begins assembling patterns, even when doing so accelerates collapse. The structure of forbidden knowledge thus mirrors archaeological excavation. Each layer removed exposes something older, stranger, and more damaging. Books that destroy readers became one of the central motifs of this tradition, yet their function is often misunderstood. The danger lies not in magic, but in information. Ancient manuscripts appear in narratives as remnants of civilizations that encountered cosmic forces long before modern history. Their surviving fragments often contain warnings, rituals, or distorted records of events that earlier cultures could not fully interpret. Occult translations amplify the danger because translating a text requires intimate engagement with its content. Linguistic precision becomes a liability. Fragmented texts, charred scrolls, incomplete codices, eroded tablets invite speculation that fills gaps with imagination, producing interpretations more dangerous than certainty. Dangerous scholarship emerges when the investigator believes understanding will produce control, a belief repeatedly undermined by the events that follow. Comparisons with real antiquarian research highlight how plausibly these fictional documents mimic academic inquiry while quietly undermining its assumptions. Knowledge without utility intensifies the horror by demonstrating that truth does not necessarily produce safety or mastery. Many characters discover facts that cannot help them because the information describes forces operating beyond human influence. A narrative may reveal the origin of a cosmic being, the pattern governing its cycles, or the scale of its domain, yet none of this knowledge provides a method of intervention. Truth that cannot help becomes indistinguishable from threat. Discovery without solution is a recurring pattern in stories where characters uncover timelines showing earlier civilizations destroyed by similar forces. Awareness without control becomes the heaviest burden since the investigator understands dangers they cannot mitigate. Triadic listing frequently appears in these moments: warning, recognition, paralysis, capturing the emotional trajectory of characters who attempt to act in a universe resistant to human intention. The culmination of forbidden knowledge is epistemological crisis. This crisis arises when the frameworks used to understand the world, science, language, perception, fail simultaneously. Science reaches limits when characters encounter phenomena that contradict empirical laws. These contradictions force reconsideration of assumptions previously treated as universal. Language fails when characters cannot describe what they see without resorting to negation, metaphor, or incoherence. Writers use this failure strategically to depict realities that exceed linguistic capacity. Observation becomes unreliable when perception itself is manipulated or distorted by encounter with cosmic forces. Truth becomes unstable not because it changes, but because the cognitive structures used to apprehend it collapse. Rhetorical questions emerge naturally. What remains of truth when the observer cannot trust their senses, their language, or their reasoning? This crisis represents the intellectual core of cosmic horror, where understanding disintegrates under the weight of its own implications. The investigator's trap completes this philosophical system. Curiosity functions as a fatal flaw because it propels the investigator toward discoveries that cannot be undone. Irreversible discoveries appear when characters uncover evidence that reshapes their understanding of reality beyond repair. Obsession cycles form as characters repeatedly return to the puzzle, believing that one final insight will restore coherence. Instead, each discovery deepens instability. Intellectual doom occurs when the character recognizes that their pursuit has no conclusion except collapse. Unlike traditional tragedy, the fall results not from moral error, but from cognitive ambition. Scholars, scientists, and archivists follow clues because their disciplines demand it, not because they seek danger. Their downfall is therefore systemic rather than personal. The logic of inquiry leads inevitably to crisis. This subsection reveals how forbidden knowledge structures the psychological and narrative mechanisms of cosmic horror. The next section turns to literature itself, examining how these ideas manifested in early stories and shaped the evolution of cosmic monsters across textual traditions. Cosmic horror's earliest manifestations appear not in modern fiction, but in ancient epic traditions that describe the universe as a contested space shaped by primordial conflict. These texts portray chaos monsters that existed before ordered creation, functioning less as antagonists than as embodiments of pre-cosmic conditions. The Enuma Elish, composed in Mesopotamia during the late 2nd millennium BCE, presents Tiamat as a generative force whose defeat enables the formation of the world. Greek sources such as Hesiod's Theogony similarly depict pre-creation beings, chaos, Gaia, Tartarus, whose presence establishes a framework older than divine governance. These deep time narratives introduce the idea that the universe possesses a history extending far beyond human scale, and that cosmic battles reflect structural tensions rather than moral struggles. Such stories provided literary precedent for later authors who sought to imagine beings of vast antiquity. We must pause here, because these epics already contain key features of cosmic horror: immense temporal scope, beings predating humanity, and conflicts operating on scales indifferent to human affairs. Early weird fiction of the 18th and 19th centuries revived these themes while reframing them through scientific and philosophical developments. Proto-cosmic creatures appeared in stories that blurred the boundary between natural and supernatural explanation. Writers described non-human intelligences that communicated through unfamiliar modes, violated natural laws, or originated in unknown dimensions. These narratives did not rely on mythological authority, but on conceptual speculation. Unknown dimensions became increasingly plausible after developments in mathematics and physics suggested that space might include more than 3 perceptible directions. Reality distortions, appearing as spatial anomalies or temporal inconsistencies, signaled the presence of forces beyond human comprehension. Such elements distinguished early weird fiction from Gothic literature, which focused on psychological uncertainty rather than metaphysical instability. Comparisons with the ancient epics reveal continuity. Both traditions portray the universe as a layered structure where visible reality represents only one among many possible domains. Recurring motifs across authors demonstrate how cosmic horror developed through shared experimentation rather than isolated innovation. Ancient sleeping beings appear repeatedly, reflecting the idea that earlier epochs produced entities capable of surviving geological or cosmic intervals. Forbidden ruins provide physical evidence of lost ages, suggesting that civilization has risen and fallen multiple times. Lost civilizations themselves function as temporal conduits by supplying records of earlier encounters with cosmic forces. Star Origins claims that certain beings arrived from distant regions of the cosmos, extend the narrative beyond Earth's history entirely. These motifs allow authors to position humanity within a continuum of forgotten pasts and unreachable futures. Triadic listing, ruins, inscriptions, relics, appears frequently as a structural device to imply layered evidence. Such motifs create intertextual resonance, making it appear as though multiple writers independently discovered fragments of the same underlying mythos. Shared mythic structures reinforce these connections. Discovery narratives frame the protagonist as an investigator uncovering material, evidence of disturbing truths. Warning texts appear within these narratives as documents left by earlier witnesses who attempted to record their experiences before succumbing to collapse. Isolated investigators populate these stories because their intellectual solitude mirrors the conceptual isolation produced by cosmic revelation. Terminal revelations conclude many early works, revealing truths too large to assimilate and leaving characters psychologically or physically destroyed. This shared narrative architecture suggests that authors recognize the dramatic potential of epistemological crisis long before cosmic horror was formally identified as a genre. The structure reflects a philosophical progression. Discovery leads to interpretation. Interpretation leads to collapse. Transmission of ideas across authors played a crucial role in shaping the early evolution of cosmic monsters. Writers borrowed imagery, adapted themes, and revised conceptual frameworks in response to one another's works. Some incorporated geological deep time from emerging scientific literature, while others drew on archaeological discoveries that revealed long-buried civilizations. Shared imagery, cyclopean architecture, forgotten manuscripts, anomalous fossils, created continuity across otherwise unrelated texts. Literary inheritance functioned not through deliberate collaboration, but through conceptual affinity. Each writer recognized the potential of earlier experiments and expanded them in new directions. Over decades, these accumulated variations produced recognizable categories of cosmic entities, primordial beings, star-born intelligences, extra-dimensional forces, and entities persistently asleep beneath the world. Not imitation, but evolution describes this process. The cosmic monster emerged through repeated attempts to depict the universe as larger, older, and less human-centered than previous literature allowed. This subsection demonstrates that cosmic horror developed through gradual refinement rather than sudden invention. The next section examines two major case studies that illustrate how early authors transformed these intertextual materials into coherent and influential narratives. The first fully developed cosmic monster narrative emerges in the late 19th century, during a period when scientific expansion, archaeological discovery, and philosophical pessimism converged to reshape the boundaries of speculative fiction. Although earlier texts hinted at primordial entities, this story distinguished itself by presenting a creature whose existence reorganized the reader's understanding of reality. Its historical placement coincides with growing public fascination with geological deep time and with the realization, widely circulated through popular science lectures of the 1870s and 1880s, that Earth's history extended far beyond human memory. The literary context reflects this shift. Authors were increasingly willing to abandon supernatural explanation in favor of speculative naturalism, imagining beings not as moral agents, but as evolutionary or cosmological phenomena. The innovation introduced here was decisive. The monster was presented not as a mythological throwback or symbolic threat, but as a living remnant of a world predating humanity, and perhaps predating terrestrial life entirely. The monster's nature derives its power from ambiguity. Physical description remains deliberately sparse, relying on suggestions rather than detailed anatomy. Writers employed non-symmetrical forms, uncertain limb structures, and shifting textures to evoke an organism incompatible with familiar biological categories. Its ontological status occupies a threshold between material and conceptual existence. The creature appears capable of influencing physical environments while simultaneously eluding stable classification. Its relationship to reality becomes a central feature. It does not simply intrude upon human domains, but demonstrates that human domains were never sovereign to begin with. The being functions as a reminder of Earth's earlier epochs, carrying traces of evolutionary trajectories abandoned long before mammals appeared. Triadic imagery, ancientness, indifference, persistence, structures its presence in the narrative, reinforcing the impression of a creature uncontained by ordinary temporal or spatial boundaries. Narrative structure plays a crucial role in establishing the monster's authenticity. The story unfolds through a discovery process resembling scientific investigation. A fragment of unusual material appears first, prompting examination by scholars who find that its properties contradict known classifications. Evidence accumulates through journals, field reports, and conflicting testimonies, each adding detail while expanding uncertainty. The narrative avoids direct confrontation, relying instead on interpretive labor. The protagonist, typically a researcher or explorer, assembles observations into a pattern that gradually reveals the creature's existence. The final revelation occurs not through spectacle, but through insight. The investigator recognizes that the evidence points toward an entity vastly older and more structurally complex than previously imagined. This revelation destabilizes the narrative world because it implies continuity between the present and earlier epochs believed to have vanished completely. The monster becomes a surviving witness to Earth's deep time history. Philosophical implications emerge directly from this structure. Human insignificance becomes unavoidable once the protagonist realizes that the creature predates humanity by millions of years. Its survival into the modern era suggests that human civilization occupies only a brief interval, one neither central nor protected. Cosmic antiquity defines the creature's primary thematic function. It embodies epochs inaccessible to human thought, challenging the assumption that human history represents a meaningful portion of Earth's timeline. Knowledge as danger appears when the protagonist attempts to articulate these implications to colleagues or institutions, only to face disbelief, denial, or psychological collapse. Consider this carefully. The horror does not arise from the creature's actions, but from what its existence reveals about the universe. The beings humans perceive as dominant species appear ephemeral when contrasted with entities capable of spanning geological intervals. The story's lasting influence extends beyond plot or imagery. Later authors drew heavily from its innovations, refining techniques of pseudo-scholarship, fragmented evidence, and investigative narrative framing. Many adopted its emphasis on indirect revelation, recognizing that suggestiveness created more lasting unease than explicit violence. The genre transformed from supernatural confrontation to epistemological crisis. The creature's ambiguous physiology became a template for later cosmic entities, encouraging writers to develop monsters that defied natural classification. Its conceptual legacy lies in demonstrating that horror can emerge from understanding rather than confrontation. Not terror of attack, but terror of implication became the defining structure. Comparisons to earlier mythological narratives highlight the magnitude of this shift. Ancient chaos monsters embodied pre-creation disorder, while this later narrative reimagined primordial beings within scientific frameworks, merging mythic scale with empirical sensibilities. This synthesis established a tradition in which cosmic monsters serve as philosophical provocations rather than narrative obstacles. The evolution of cosmic horror owes much to this early story, which proved that the most disturbing monsters are those that enlarge the universe rather than threaten the individual. The next case study explores how a subsequent narrative expanded these innovations, intensifying thematic complexity while deepening the philosophical structure underlying cosmic horror's emerging canon. The second major narrative in cosmic horror's development expands the monster concept well beyond the boundaries established by earlier works. Where the first case introduced deep time and evolutionary ambiguity, this later story transforms the cosmic being into an ontological problem, something that destabilizes reality itself rather than merely predating it. The evolution from earlier works becomes apparent in the story's willingness to abandon residual biological frameworks. Instead of depicting the monster as a relic from an ancient epoch, the narrative positions it as a presence operating on a more explicit cosmic scale. Its origins lie not in Earth's forgotten past, but in regions of space or dimensions of existence inaccessible to human perception. This expansion produces increased philosophical depth, since the creature's existence forces reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about identity, space, and time. The monster functions primarily as a challenge to ontology. Writers portray it not through anatomy or behavior, but through the distortions it produces in reality. Distances shift, objects duplicate, shadows detach from their sources. Physical laws appear to bend around the creature, suggesting that its nature contradicts the structural coherence of the world. Identity instability follows naturally. Characters observing the entity struggle to determine where it begins or ends, whether it possesses discrete parts, or even whether it exists in a singular form at all. Some descriptions imply that the monster occupies several positions simultaneously, or that it appears differently depending on the observer's perspective. Perceptual collapse becomes the culminating effect. The mind cannot integrate contradictory sensory information, producing fragmentation rather than comprehension. The horror lies not in attack, but in destabilization. The monster's mere presence reveals weaknesses in the cognitive structures that uphold ordinary experience. Narrative techniques reinforce this ontological disruption. Fragmented storytelling becomes a dominant feature, with events recorded out of sequence or presented through inconsistent accounts. Writers use multiple narrators, damaged documents, or conflicting testimonies to show that reliable observation is impossible. Indirect description also plays a crucial role. The creature is rarely depicted directly. Instead, its effects on environment and characters communicate its presence. Suggestive horror replaces explicit revelation, relying on implications that readers assemble into an incomplete but disturbing picture. This method mirrors the philosophical content. Just as the characters cannot perceive the creature directly, readers cannot receive a stable account. Comparisons to earlier Gothic techniques reveal an important distinction. In Gothic literature, fragmentation reflects psychological turmoil. In cosmic horror, it reflects structural instability in the universe itself. Psychological themes deepen the narrative's impact. Obsession frequently becomes the protagonist's defining trait, not because they seek danger, but because they cannot abandon a pattern once glimpsed. The structure of the story encourages this, offering fragments of information that promise coherence, yet continually evade it. Isolation soon follows. The investigator's insights separate them from social institutions, colleagues, and friends who regard their discoveries as delusional or irrelevant. This social fragmentation mirrors the perceptual fragmentation caused by the entity. Cognitive breakdown becomes inevitable as the protagonist attempts to reconcile mutually incompatible realities. Writers describe sleeplessness, compulsive note-taking, and linguistic deterioration, suggesting that the mind's attempt to impose order accelerates its collapse. Such themes exemplify cosmic horror's commitment to epistemological tension. Knowledge both compels and destroys. The influence of this story on the cosmic horror tradition cannot be overstated. It introduced new archetypes, particularly the notion of an entity defined not by form, but by function, an agent of distortion rather than a creature with recognizable anatomy. Later authors adopted this idea, creating monsters whose existence destabilizes narrative structure itself. Narrative innovations also proliferated. The use of multiple subjective accounts, fragmented chronology, and perceptual disorientation became hallmarks of the genre. Writers recognized that cosmic horror depends more on the erosion of certainty than on the presence of supernatural beings. Conceptual expansion followed as authors explored entities inhabiting parallel dimensions, existing outside linear time, or interacting with consciousness rather than matter. These developments reshaped the genre's trajectory, moving it away from evolutionary speculation and toward metaphysical inquiry. Consider this carefully. The monster in this second case study is not an organism, but a theorem made visible. It exists to demonstrate limits of perception, of cognition, and of human narrative. Its purpose is not to terrify characters, but to annihilate their frameworks of understanding. The next subsection analyzes how entire literary communities extended these innovations, building collaborative mythologies that transformed isolated experiments into enduring structures of cosmic horror. Early cosmic horror did not develop through isolated authors working independently. It evolved through a gradual and often unspoken collaboration in which writers expanded one another's ideas, producing shared mythologies long before any formal system existed. Authors borrowed narrative devices, atmospheric techniques, and conceptual frameworks, creating bodies of work that appeared interlinked even when no explicit coordination occurred. Shared entities emerged as earlier monsters were reinterpreted, renamed, or transplanted into new contexts. Connected texts referenced each other obliquely. An inscription from one story resurfaced in another, or a ruin described in one narrative appeared again with additional detail. This layering of implied history produced mythological density, as though writers were collectively uncovering fragments of a single ancient record. Mythological layering functioned as both creative method and thematic statement. Cosmic truth is too large for any one narrator to capture, so multiple perspectives accumulate into an incomplete but compelling map of the unknown. The systemization of these elements accelerated when August Derleth attempted to organize the scattered cosmic materials into a coherent structure. Derleth introduced classificatory systems that arranged cosmic entities according to elemental forces, moral alignments, and narrative hierarchies. His approach borrowed from medieval angelology and early modern demonology, imposing order where earlier authors preserved ambiguity. Organizing cosmic entities transformed them from unclassifiable presences into members of a structured cosmos. Moral interpretations entered the tradition as Derleth mapped certain beings to destructive tendencies and others to balancing or generative roles. Structural mythologies emerged, providing genealogies, territorial domains, and historical epochs for entities previously left undefined. Comparisons with natural history are instructive here. Derleth treated cosmic beings as though they belonged to a taxonomy awaiting formal description. Yet this systemization subtly altered the tone of cosmic horror, reducing mystery by implying that the universe followed recognizable patterns. Expansion continued as later weird fiction writers adopted, revised, or resisted these frameworks. Some embraced systemization by introducing new cosmic monsters that fit within established genealogies, expanding universes across multiple authors and decades. Others rejected fixed hierarchies, returning to earlier principles of ambiguity and ontological uncertainty. The result was an increasingly diversified genre in which cosmic creatures ranged from primordial energies to extra-dimensional intelligences to buried giants awaiting reawakening. Expanded universes emerged as writers incorporated astronomy, quantum speculation, psychology, and evolutionary theory, transforming cosmic horror into a flexible platform for exploring metaphysical questions. Each new edition shifted the balance between revelation and uncertainty. Triadic grouping, New entities, revised frameworks, alternative interpretations became a recurring pattern in collaborative expansions. The evolution of the cosmic monster reflects this tension between codification and mystery. Early beings remained unknowable, their attributes undefined and their intentions inaccessible. Later, reinterpretations introduced increasing detail, biological descriptions, behavioral tendencies, or even implied motivations. Categorization brought coherence, but also narrowed conceptual space. Once named and classified, a creature became less threatening because it could be placed within an explanatory framework. The loss of mystery altered the reader's experience. What once seemed vast and incomprehensible began to resemble an elaborate mythology rather than an existential threat. Yet some authors intentionally preserved ambiguity, describing their monsters only through metaphor, distortion, or incomplete testimony. This resistance to explanation kept the genre's philosophical foundation intact. A persistent tension therefore emerged between explanation and horror. Systemization reduces dread because it implies that the universe is ultimately intelligible, even if dangerous. Mystery preserves unease because it denies closure. Cosmic horror thrives on incomplete knowledge, precisely because this incompleteness mirrors the human condition. When a universe becomes fully mapped, it loses its ability to overwhelm. But when knowledge remains partial, when documents are fragmented, testimonies contradictory, or entities only partially described, the reader confronts the limits of comprehension. Incomplete knowledge becomes not a flaw, but a necessity. It ensures that cosmic horror remains aligned with its philosophical origins, presenting monsters as evidence of a reality too large, too ancient, and too indifferent for human minds to contain. This concludes the literary groundwork for cosmic entities. The next section will examine their afterlife beyond literature, how myths, hoaxes, and modern cultural forms transformed these monsters into recurring features of contemporary imagination. Cosmic horror's cultural afterlife depends not only on literature, but on the persistent human tendency to treat the unknown as a living category. Urban legends of ancient creatures circulate because they offer continuity with earlier mythologies while adapting to modern anxieties. Sea monster traditions, for instance, draw simultaneously from Mesopotamian chaos imagery and from 19th century maritime exploration, which revealed oceanic depths far exceeding anything previously imagined. Reports of serpentine forms, tentacled silhouettes, or massive shadows beneath ships reflect an intuitive recognition that the sea represents pre-human time made visible. Hidden civilizations likewise function as temporal anomalies, societies supposedly preserved in isolation from geological upheavals or evolutionary change. Subterranean beings extend this logic downward, proposing that Earth contains interior realms untouched by surface history. These legends echo literary cosmic horror by positioning humanity on the periphery of a much older and more complex structure, one that occasionally reveals itself through ambiguous encounters. Pseudo-archaeology amplifies these impulses by offering narratives in which ancient evidence points toward non-human precursors. Lost species claims appear whenever unusual fossils or anomalous artifacts surface, allowing interpreters to imagine evolutionary branches that diverged from known pathways. Ancient alien theories pursue a similar logic, suggesting that early civilizations recorded contact with beings whose origins lie beyond Earth. Whether presented through monumental architecture, cryptic inscriptions, or unexplained technological feats, these claims imply forbidden discoveries. knowledge removed from official histories because it disrupts conventional narratives. Hidden histories become a thematic anchor within such discourse, echoing the literary device of fragmented testimony. Triadic accumulation, artifact, inscription, interpretation, creates the illusion of continuity, even when evidence remains speculative. We must pause here because pseudo-archaeology demonstrates how cosmic horror escapes fiction by offering frameworks that mimic scholarly inquiry while bypassing scholarly rigor. The Internet era intensified these tendencies by enabling collaborative myth-making on an unprecedented scale. Found footage narratives, emerging widely in the early 2000s, presented cosmic encounters through handheld recordings, security cameras, or corrupted digital files. The format suggested immediacy while retaining ambiguity, allowing anomalies to appear as glitches, distortions, or unexplained shapes. Analog horror traditions expanded this aesthetic by repurposing obsolete media formats, VHS tapes, broadcast interruptions, instructional videos, whose degraded quality naturally obscured detail. These works rely on implication rather than depiction, mirroring earlier literary strategies of indirect revelation. Online communities then extend these narratives collaboratively, adding documents, sightings, or fictional research notes. The result resembles mythological layering. Multiple creators contribute fragments that accumulate into a coherent but unofficial cosmology. Unlike print literature, which depends on authorial control, Internet cosmic horror evolves through collective speculation. Modern sightings continue to lend plausibility to these cultural myths. Deep-sea anomalies recorded by remotely operated vehicles present shapes or movements that resist immediate classification. Unknown creatures photographed near thermal vents or continental shelves reinforce the belief that Earth still contains regions beyond scientific survey. Witness testimonies, particularly from sailors, pilots, or remote researchers, describe experiences interpreted variously as biological anomalies, atmospheric distortions, or psychological phenomena. Psychological explanations, pareidolia, stress responses, or expectation-driven perception provide naturalistic alternatives but rarely diminish public fascination. The ambiguity itself sustains belief. A phenomenon that defies full explanation becomes fertile ground for cosmic interpretation. Comparisons with earlier sea monster traditions reveal continuity. Uncertainty functions as catalyst rather than obstacle. The persistence of belief in cosmic monsters reveals something fundamental about human cognition. People want such beings to exist because they represent the possibility that the world contains layers not yet reduced to measurement or classification. Fear of hidden worlds coexists with attraction to them. The unknown threatens, but also enriches, imagination. Mystery becomes an intellectual resource, enabling reflection on humanity's limited perspective within a larger, incomprehensible structure. Consider this carefully. Belief in cosmic monsters persists not despite scientific progress, but because of it. The more humanity learns about the universe's scale, the more plausible it becomes that life, or non-life, might exist in forms beyond recognition. Intellectual fascination, therefore, sustains these myths. Cosmic horror survives in public consciousness because it offers a conceptual space where uncertainty remains allowed, even welcomed, in an increasingly mapped and measured world. The next subsection examines how these cultural patterns extend into film, games, and music, transforming literary concepts into immersive aesthetic experiences that reshape how audiences perceive cosmic dread. Early cinematic engagements with cosmic horror emerged during the silent film era, when visual limitations forced directors to rely on implication rather than display. Expressionist cinema of the 1920s, shaped by exaggerated shadows and distorted sets, created atmospheres that suggested unseen presences rather than depicting them. Silent film influences encouraged suggestive horror because sound design, practical effects, and creature construction remained rudimentary. Directors compensated by using light, framing, and interruption to hint at forces operating beyond human perception. These constraints inadvertently aligned the medium with cosmic horror's philosophical core. The most disturbing entities are those that cannot be cleanly represented. Visual limitations preserved ambiguity by preventing filmmakers from attempting literal depiction. Consider this carefully. Early cinema succeeded precisely because it lacked the tools to violate cosmic horror's fundamental principle. The unknowable cannot be shown without diminishing its impact. Modern cinema faces a different challenge. With digital effects capable of displaying almost anything, filmmakers have increasingly attempted to visualize the unknowable directly. Some achieve partial success by emphasizing scale, texture, or spatial distortion rather than biological detail. Others default to spectacle, revealing creatures too clearly and thereby sacrificing existential dread for visual novelty. The tension between ambiguity and spectacle dominates contemporary adaptations. When films treat cosmic beings as threats that can be fought or analyzed, they drift toward science fiction or monster cinema rather than genuine cosmic horror. Yet a few productions preserve uncertainty by focusing on perceptual disorientation, non-linear storytelling, and atmospheric immersion. Failures arise when the narrative prioritizes resolution. Successes occur when it preserves unanswered questions. Comparisons to early film highlight an irony. Technological advancement made depiction possible, but did not make it wise. Video games introduced a new dimension by transforming cosmic horror from a passive viewing experience into an interactive one. Exploration-based games allow players to traverse worlds designed around environmental storytelling rather than combat. Abandoned research stations, collapsing dimensions, and non-Euclidean corridors become interactive spaces where the player uncovers fragments of information at their own pace. This format aligns closely with cosmic horror's investigative tradition. Interactive cosmic horror leverages uncertainty by limiting visibility, manipulating sound cues, or altering the environment in response to player movement. Some games use mechanics that disrupt player expectations, shifting architecture, corrupted interfaces, or distorted physics to simulate cognitive instability. Unlike film, which must choose what to show, games allow horror to emerge from what the player cannot reach, decipher, or control. Rhetorical questions arise naturally in this medium. If a player cannot interpret their surroundings, what does it mean to progress through the game world? Music and sound design contribute profoundly to cosmic horror adaptations by shaping atmosphere. Sonic dread emerges from techniques that resist traditional melody or harmonic resolution. Composers rely on drones, dissonance, low-frequency resonance, and irregular rhythms to evoke vastness or instability. Non-traditional composition, such as granular, synthesis, field recordings, or electronically manipulated vocals, creates soundscapes that feel organic yet non-human. These techniques mirror cosmic horror's themes by challenging auditory expectations. A sound that cannot be comfortably categorized implies a world where familiar sensory structures fail. Music therefore becomes an interpretive lens, reinforcing the emotional and philosophical implications of the narrative. Visual art extends these explorations through surrealism and abstraction. Surrealist painters of the early 20th century experimented with forms that resisted anatomical coherence, aligning unintentionally with cosmic horror's fascination with non-human shapes. Abstract monsters appear frequently in modern digital illustration, where artists prioritize impossible geometry, fluid architecture, or hybrid organisms assembled from incompatible structures. Such imagery echoes earlier literary descriptions that relied on suggestion rather than detail. Visual art thrives precisely because it can leave boundaries undefined. A creature painted without clear limbs, orientation, or spatial consistency becomes a conceptual puzzle rather than a biological specimen. The viewer confronts an image that refuses interpretation, thereby enacting cosmic horror's philosophical premise. Reality contains forms the mind cannot comfortably organize. Collectively, film, games, music, and visual art demonstrate how cosmic horror adapts to new media while preserving its core themes. Each medium confronts the same problem: how to represent the unrepresentable, and each resolves it differently. The next subsection turns to the cultural and academic appropriations that transformed cosmic horror from niche fiction into a broader intellectual and subcultural phenomenon. Cosmic horror's migration beyond literature produced a range of subcultural and academic appropriations, each reshaping the genre to suit new interpretive frameworks. Occult interpretations emerged first, not because the narratives encouraged ritual practice, but because their symbolic density invited metaphysical speculation. Ritual reinterpretations appeared when readers adapted fragments of fictional grimoires into ceremonial scripts, treating invented sigils or incantations as symbolic tools rather than literal mechanisms. Modern myth-making followed, with practitioners incorporating cosmic entities into eclectic spiritual systems built from astrology, hermeticism, and chaos magic. Symbolic use dominated these adaptations. Cosmic beings represented forces such as entropy, transformation, or the dissolution of ego. The intent was not to summon monsters, but to appropriate their conceptual power. We must pause here, because this phenomenon reveals a consistent pattern. When fiction offers vast, ambiguous symbols, subcultures reinterpret them to suit their own philosophical needs. Academic analysis developed along a parallel but distinct path. Literary criticism treated cosmic horror as a response to 19th century scientific upheavals, analyzing how deep time, evolutionary theory, and astronomical scale reshaped narrative possibilities. Psychological interpretation focused on themes of fragmentation, projection, and cognitive instability, linking cosmic encounters to states of dissociation or epistemic trauma. Philosophical studies expanded these conversations by situating cosmic horror within broader debates about existentialism, nihilism, and the limits of human cognition. Scholars approach the texts as theoretical artifacts rather than entertainment, examining narrative strategies that destabilize reader assumptions. Comparisons with other traditions, mythology, surrealism, existential philosophy, became common as researchers traced patterns across genres and historical periods. Academic analysis ultimately positioned cosmic horror as a literary form concerned with epistemology rather than emotion. Fan scholarship represents another major appropriative mode. Enthusiasts construct elaborate timelines, genealogies, and cosmologies by synthesizing fragments scattered across multiple works. Collaborative research, conducted through forums, wikis, and annotated editions, treats the stories as parts of a larger, partially recoverable history. Timeline building attempts to reconcile contradictions produced by different authors, often through interpretive ingenuity rather than strict textual fidelity. Theory construction thrives in this environment. Fans propose explanations for entity origins, cosmological mechanics, and intertext relationships, generating models more systematic than those found in the original fiction. This collective interpretive labor echoes academic method while remaining driven by imaginative engagement. It transforms reading into reconstruction, making readers active participants in the myth-making process. Online communities amplify these practices through collaborative myth-building. Users create shared interpretations, develop speculative expansions, and circulate artifacts, maps, documents, illustrations that enrich collective understanding. Expanding universes emerge as hundreds of participants contribute fragments resembling ancient manuscripts, field reports, or eyewitness testimonies. The communal nature of these projects mirrors oral tradition. Stories evolve, split, and recombine as new contributors reinterpret existing material. The Internet's archival memory allows these contributions to accumulate into intricate mythologies rivaling those of formal literary canons. Triadic layering, fan theory, visual artifact, narrative fragment, reinforces the sense of a living, ever-growing cosmology. Cosmic horror ultimately becomes an intellectual hobby for many readers. They approach texts not as passive consumers, but as investigators searching for patterns, inconsistencies, and hidden implications. Research becomes entertainment, drawing on linguistic analysis, historical contextualization, and cross-text comparison. Scholarly fandom emerges from this process, blending academic rigor with imaginative curiosity. Readers treat fictional entities as problems to be solved, cosmologies to be mapped, or metaphysical puzzles to be contemplated. This mode of engagement preserves the genre's emphasis on inquiry. The pleasure lies not in resolution, but in sustained investigation, a conceptual echo of the original narratives, which portrayed knowledge as both irresistible and destabilizing. The next subsection considers why these traditions persist. The enduring psychological and philosophical implications that ensure cosmic horror remains relevant even as scientific understanding advances. Cosmic horror persists because it articulates ideas that cannot be forgotten once they are introduced. Deep time awareness confronts readers with a scale so immense that human chronology becomes an afterthought. Civilizations appear and vanish against geological processes that continue indifferently, reinforcing human fragility. Cosmic scale pushes this further. When the universe is understood as vast beyond comprehension, every human endeavor appears transient. These realizations cannot be undone because they arise from real scientific and philosophical principles. Once someone grasps the immensity of cosmic time and space, the framework of ordinary life feels smaller, thinner, and more precarious. The genre thrives on this irreversible cognitive shift. Modern scientific echoes amplify these psychological effects. Contemporary cosmology proposes models of a universe structured by forces we cannot yet explain. Multiverse theory introduces conceptual space where countless unseen realities coexist, any of which may dwarf or nullify our own. Dark matter and dark energy, comprising most of the universe yet virtually undetectable, parallel cosmic horror's emphasis on unseen powers. Unknown forces shape cosmic structure while remaining inaccessible to human perception, much like the fictional entities that operate beyond human comprehension. Readers recognize these parallels intuitively. Cosmic horror feels increasingly plausible because the scientific worldview itself grows increasingly strange. Cosmic horror also functions as philosophy. Existentialism appears in the tension between human meaning-making and an indifferent universe. Nihilism emerges when characters confront truths that invalidate all human narratives of purpose. Absurdism follows when the quest for meaning meets cosmic silence. These philosophical traditions resonate with cosmic horror because they share a central premise. Humans desire coherence, but the universe offers none. Horror arises not from monstrosity, but from incompatibility between human expectations and cosmic reality. The philosophical implications become emotionally charged because they undermine the structures people rely on for psychological stability. The psychological effects of these realizations are complex. Sublime terror arises when vastness becomes overwhelming, but remains awe-inspiring. It is fear mingled with fascination, a response to encountering something too large for comprehension. Intellectual awe follows from contemplating structures, timelines, or forces beyond anything humans evolved to understand. Existential reflection becomes inevitable. Readers re-examine themselves against the backdrop of cosmic immensity and recognize how fragile individual consciousness is. The genre invites a contemplative dread that does not recede easily. Even when the story ends, the implications linger. The oldest monsters matter because they embody fears that transcend culture and time. Timeless fears of insignificance, of the unknown, of dissolution, remain psychologically potent regardless of scientific progress. Intellectual unease persists because these monsters symbolize questions without answers, limits without solutions. Permanent mystery becomes a defining feature of cosmic horror. The entities survive in cultural memory not because of their visual form, but because they represent vastness, indifference, and incomprehensibility. As long as humans seek meaning in a universe that offers none, the oldest monsters will remain relevant. They are mirrors held to the limits of human cognition, a reminder that some truths exceed the mind's capacity to endure.